The boy sat on the front step of Blackthorn Hall with a carved wooden bird in his lap and his legs swinging over the edge of the stone. He was 5 years old, and his shoes were too small, and his coat had been buttoned wrong, the top button through the second hole, so the collar pulled sideways against his throat. He did not seem to mind. He held the bird the way children hold things they have carried a long distance, loosely, as if his fingers had memorized the shape and no longer needed to grip. Dawn light touched the gravel drive. Somewhere inside the house, a clock struck 6. Rosalind watched from the shadow of the servants' passage, 30 feet above and to the left, through a window so filthy the glass turned the morning amber. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. The stone was cold. Her breath came in shallow pulls, and she counted each one, because counting was the only thing her mind could do that was not screaming. She had placed him there 11 minutes ago. She had knelt on the wet gravel, buttoned his coat wrong because her hands would not stop shaking, and said the words she had rehearsed in the dark for 3 nights. "Thomas, Mama needs you to sit here and wait. A kind man lives in this house. He will come to the door, and he will see you, and he will take you inside and give you breakfast. You must not cry. You must hold your bird and wait." Thomas had looked at her with his father's dark eyes and said, "Will you come back?" "Yes," she had lied. And then she had kissed the top of his head, where his hair smelled of dust, and the wool blanket they had shared in the east wing for 8 days. And she had walked back through the servants' entrance and up the narrow stair, and she had come to this window to watch, because she was not strong enough to leave without seeing him safe. She was supposed to be gone by now. That had been the plan. Leave the boy, slip through the kitchen garden before the cook arrived, cross the north meadow to the coaching road, disappear. She had a half-crown sewn into her petticoat hem, and the name of a boarding house in Hartford, where they did not ask questions. She had stolen 3 pages from her husband's account ledger, the ones with the columns that did not add up, and folded them into the lining of her stays. She had everything she needed to vanish. But she had not moved. She stood at the window, her forehead nearly touching the glass, and she watched her son sit perfectly still on a stranger's doorstep because she had asked him to. And the stillness of him cracked something open inside her chest that she had spent 8 days bricking shut. The front door opened. The man who stepped out was not what she expected. She had imagined someone old. Lord Vane's business partners were always old, always soft around the middle, always smelling of port and tobacco. This man was tall and angular, dark-haired, dressed in riding clothes, as though he had already been awake for some time. He stopped 3 feet from the boy and stood very still. She watched his body, the way his weight shifted back slightly, the way his hands stayed at his sides. He did not lunge. He did not shout. He looked at the child the way a man looks at something he does not understand, but knows is important. Thomas looked up at him and held out the wooden bird. "Mama said to wait." The Duke crouched, slowly, the way you crouch near an animal you do not want to frighten. His knees touched the gravel. He was at the boy's eye level now, and Rosalind could not see his face, but she could see the angle of his shoulders, and they carried no threat. "Where is your mama?" His voice was low, not gentle, careful. The voice of a man who had learned that carelessness costs. "She went to sleep," Thomas said, which was the story Rosalind had told him. She closed her eyes. The stone pressed cold against her palm. She should move. She should go now, while the Duke was occupied, while the servants' passage was empty, while the morning mist still clung to the meadow thick enough to hide a woman running. She opened her eyes and watched the Duke pick up her son. He lifted him without awkwardness, one arm under, one hand steadying the boy's back, and Thomas settled against his shoulder, as though he had been carried by this man before. The carved bird pressed between their bodies. The Duke turned toward the house, and Rosalind saw his face. the jaw set, the brow drawn, a crease between his eyes that she recognized. She had seen it in her own face in the mirror at the inn in Dunstable, the night she had decided to run. It was the look of a person deciding something they could not undo. He carried Thomas inside, and the door closed. Rosalind leaned her back against the passage wall and slid down until she sat on the stone floor. Her knees came up, her arms wrapped around them. She was shaking, not crying. She had used her last tears 4 days ago. But her body vibrated with a frequency she could not control, the way a string vibrates after the note has been struck. 1 more day. She would stay 1 more day. She would watch from behind the walls and make sure the household treated Thomas well. And if they were kind to him, she would leave tomorrow. She would leave tomorrow for certain. She did not leave tomorrow. The east wing of Blackthorn Hall had been closed since the previous Duchess died 7 years earlier. Rosalind had discovered this her first night, when she had pried open a window from the garden side and climbed through into a drawing room thick with dust and sheet-covered furniture. The air had tasted of mildew and cold fireplace ash. She had stood in the dark, Thomas asleep on her shoulder, and listened. No footsteps above, no voices below, no creak of a door being opened to investigate. The east wing was dead to the household. It was perfect. She had found a bedroom on the second floor with a mattress that smelled of lavender and moth powder. The bedding was folded in a cedar chest, old but clean. She had made the bed in the dark by touch, laid Thomas on it, and then sat on the floor with her back against the door and her husband's account pages spread across her lap, tracing the numbers with her fingertip in the moonlight through the window. Column 7. That was where the lie lived. Expenditures for property maintenance on an estate Lord Vane had sold 3 years ago. £1,500 a year, flowing to a property that did not exist, recorded in her husband's hand, initialed by a witness she did not recognize. She had found it 6 weeks ago, sitting at his desk after he had gone out. She had been looking for pin money because he had stopped giving her any, and instead she had found a ledger that proved her husband was embezzling from his own business partnership. She had not told him what she found. She had smiled at dinner and passed the salt and said, "Yes, my lord," and "Of course, my lord." And 2 weeks later, when he hit her hard enough to crack something in her left hand that still would not bend properly, she had taken the 3 most damning pages, taken Thomas, and walked out of the house at 4 in the morning with no carriage, no maid, no plan, except north. North because Lord Vane's world faced south. His clubs, his partners, his friends, his reputation, all of it orbited London like planets around a sun. North was dark. North was nothing. North was Blackthorn Hall, which she knew only as a name on one of the account pages. Property of the Duke of Ashworth, Vane's primary business partner, 3 days' travel from London on bad roads. She had chosen it because it was the last place anyone would look. The wife of Lord Vane, hiding in the home of Lord Vane's business partner. It was absurd. It was the kind of decision a desperate woman makes at 3 in the morning with a sleeping child and a broken hand. It was either brilliant or catastrophic, and she had not yet determined which. 8 days. She had survived 8 days in the East Wing, drinking water from a basin she refilled at the garden pump after midnight, eating what she could take from the kitchen stores without notice, a heel of bread here, an apple there, once a wedge of cheese that she had split with Thomas, and they had eaten sitting on the dusty drawing-room floor like 2 mice at a picnic. Thomas had treated it as an adventure. He was 5. He did not understand that his mother's hand was broken, or that his father had done it, or that they were hiding in a dead woman's bedroom, in a house that belonged to a man who could, with a single word, send them back to the exact thing they had fled. He understood that Mamma whispered instead of talked, and that they played the quiet game every time footsteps passed below. in that the carved bird was his job to carry. He was good at carrying things. But he was 5, and 5-year-olds do not stay quiet. On the 6th day, he had laughed. A full, bright, ringing laugh at a spider building a web in the corner of the bedroom. And Rosalind had clapped her good hand over his mouth and held it there until the sound died, and felt like every terrible thing her husband had ever done to her was now something she was doing to her own son. That was when she decided. She could not keep him here. She could not keep him silent and hungry and hidden like a secret. He deserved a door that opened, a table with food on it, a person who knelt to his height and spoke to him without whispering. If the Duke of Ashworth was even a fraction of the man his household suggested, the cook who sang, the stable boy who whistled, the housekeeper who left flowers in the hallway vases, even though no one lived in the main rooms to see them, then Thomas would be safe. She would leave the boy. She would disappear. It was the right thing. She had planned it so carefully. And now it was the morning after, and she was still here, sitting on the floor of the servants' passage, listening through the walls for the sound of her son's voice somewhere in the house below. She heard it at noon, Thomas chattering, and another voice, the Duke's, lower, measured, asking questions with the patient cadence of a man who has cleared his afternoon. "What does your bird eat?" "Seeds, and sometimes cake." "That seems reasonable." Rosalind pressed her ear to the wall and closed her eyes and listened to her son talk to a stranger about the dietary preferences of a wooden bird. And for the first time in 6 weeks, the knot below her sternum loosened by a single thread. She stayed another day, and another. On the 3rd day, after she had placed Thomas at the door, Rosalind noticed the curtain. It hung in the east wing corridor, a floor-length panel of moss-green damask, and it had torn along the top where the brass rings met the rod. The tear was old. It had been there when she arrived. But now, standing in the corridor with nothing to do and nowhere to go, and the slow erosion of hiding chewing at her sanity, it bothered her. It bothered her the way a crooked picture frame bothers a person with nothing left to control. She mended it. She found a sewing kit in the cedar chest, threaded a needle with the wrong hand because her left still would not grip, and sat on the floor beneath the window where the light was good, and stitched the damask back together. It took her 40 minutes, because she was working one-handed, and because she had to stop twice when footsteps passed below, freezing with the needle mid-pull until the sound faded. When she finished, she stood back and looked at the curtain, and felt something she had not felt in months. Competence. A small, warm coal of it in her chest. She had fixed a thing. She had taken something torn and made it whole. It was absurd to feel triumph over a curtain, but she had learned in the last 8 days that survival measured itself in absurdly small victories. The next day, she organized the abandoned stillroom. It was off the east wing kitchen, a narrow room lined with shelves of dusty jars, dried herbs, preserves long past their use, bottles of tincture with labels in a feminine hand. The previous Duchess's work. Rosalind sorted them by type, discarded the ones that had turned, wiped the shelves with the damp cloth. She worked in silence, moving carefully, listening always for the sound of approaching feet. The day after that, she found the wine cellar, or rather, the passage from the east wing kitchen that led down to it, a narrow stone stair with a locked door at the bottom that someone had left unlocked years ago. The cellar was vast, cool, and disordered. Bottles on their sides, labels peeling, no system. She spent 3 hours arranging them by region and vintage, her good hand lifting each bottle to the candle to read the label, her broken hand bracing against her hip. She was not doing this for the Duke. She was doing it because her mind needed occupation, the way her lungs needed air. And if she sat still in that bedroom for 1 more hour, she would start screaming and not stop. She was doing it because she had run a household of 32 rooms and 11 servants for 7 years before her husband decided her competence was a threat to be punished rather than an asset to be valued. She was doing it because mending a curtain, organizing a still room, and sorting a wine cellar were the only power she had left, and she would be damned before she gave that up too. The Duke noticed on the 4th day. She heard him below, his boot falls on stone, a sound she had memorized. He walked with purpose, each step landing flat and certain, the stride of a man who knew the dimensions of every room in his house. She could track him through the walls, the entrance hall, stone, echoing, the corridor, wood, muffled, the study, carpet, silent until the chair scraped. She knew when he was reading, silence, pages turning. When he was writing, the scratch of a pen, small pauses. When he was with Thomas, his voice dropping to a register she had not heard him use with anyone else, warm and slightly bewildered, as though the boy's questions were equations he found genuinely challenging. On this 4th day, his footsteps deviated. They left the study and went east, toward the corridor that connected the main house to the east wing. She heard the door handle turn. The door between the two wings, the one that had been locked and stiff when she first forced it open, now opened smoothly because she had oiled the hinges 3 days ago with lamp oil from the still room. She froze. She was in the east wing kitchen, halfway through cleaning a copper pot she had found under a shelf. His footsteps entered the east wing corridor. They stopped. She imagined him seeing the mended curtain, the swept floor, the vase she had filled with wildflowers from the garden because the corridor had looked so lifeless without them. His footsteps moved on, slow now, not the purposeful stride she knew, something more cautious. He was looking. He was seeing what she had done, and he was trying to understand who had done it. She set down the copper pot without a sound, pressed herself against the still room wall, and waited. Her pulse was in her ears. Her broken hand throbbed. The footsteps passed the still room door, so close she could hear the fabric of his coat brushing the doorframe, and continued down the corridor toward the staircase. She heard him climb. She heard him reach the 2nd floor. She heard him open the door to the bedroom where she slept, and in the silence that followed, she knew he was standing in the room looking at the made bed, the folded blanket, the basin of water, the sewing kit on the windowsill. The footsteps came back, faster now, down the stairs, through the corridor, and she tracked them with her ear against the wall, not toward the main house, toward the still room, toward her. The door opened. He filled the frame, tall, dark-haired, his riding coat still damp at the shoulders from the morning's mist. His eyes found her immediately, pressed against the far wall between a shelf of empty jars and a rack of dried rosemary, and something moved across his face. Not anger, not surprise. The same crease between his brows she had seen when he lifted Thomas from the step. The look of a man who is rearranging what he thinks he knows. "You've been here the whole time." Not a question. Rosalind's spine straightened. Her chin came up. Her broken hand hung at her side, and she did not hide it. "Yes." "You're the boy's mother?" "Yes." "How long?" 8 days before I put him at your door. 12 days total." He stared at her. His jaw worked, the muscle along the hinge flexing once, twice. He looked at the cleaned shelves, the sorted jars, the damp cloth folded neatly on the counter. He looked at her hand, the one that would not bend, and his gaze stayed there 2 seconds longer than it should have. "You oiled the hinges." "They squeaked." "You mended the curtain in the corridor." "It was torn." "You sorted my wine cellar." "It was a disgrace." She heard her own voice, not the whisper she had used for 12 days, but her real voice, low and sharp, and carrying the particular edge of a woman who has been afraid for so long that fear has fermented into something harder. If you're going to keep Burgundy and Bordeaux on the same rack, you might as well drink vinegar. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, the ghost of one, suppressed before it fully formed. Most intruders rob the wine cellar. They don't alphabetize it. I'm not most intruders. No. He leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. He was blocking the exit, but his body language was not aggressive. It was the posture of a man settling in for a conversation he did not intend to lose. You're the intruder who broke into a duke's home with a child, hid for nearly a fortnight, improved the East Wing without permission, and then, when discovered, criticized my wine storage. Your Chateauneuf du Pape was on its side. It should be stored upright. The sediment, who are you? The question landed like a stone in still water. She felt the ripples of it in her chest. She could lie. She had a story prepared. A widow, displaced, traveling north, desperate. She had rehearsed it in the dark until the words felt as smooth as prayer. But she looked at this man, who had crouched in the gravel for her son, who had cleared his afternoon for questions about wooden birds, who had followed a trail of mended curtains through his own house with curiosity instead of fury. And she found that the lie would not come. My name is Rosalind. My son's name is Thomas. I left my husband 12 days ago because he broke my hand, and I decided that was the last thing of mine he would break. She held up her left hand, the fingers curled stiff and wrong. I chose your house because it was the last place he would look. I put Thomas at your door because I could not keep him hidden any longer, and I would rather leave him with a stranger who might be kind than keep him with a mother who was failing. Her voice did not crack. She would not allow it. You can throw me out, but the boy stays. The Duke did not move. His arms stayed crossed. His eyes stayed on her face. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10. And in it, Rosalind heard the house breathing around them. The tick of a pipe expanding in the wall. A bird outside the still room window. The distant clatter of the kitchen below. What is your husband's name? She had known this question was coming. She had dreaded it more than any other. Why? Because a woman with a broken hand and a child does not run to the middle of nowhere without a reason that has a name. She looked at the doorway behind him. The corridor was dim. The mended curtain hung straight and whole at the far end. She had 12 days of hiding in her bones, and 3 stolen pages in her stays, and a half-crown in her hem, and if he turned her out, she could be at the coaching road by nightfall. My husband is Lord Vane. The Duke went still. Not the careful stillness of before, a different kind. The kind that starts in the spine and radiates outward until even the breath stops. She watched his face change. The crease between his brows deepened into something darker. His arms uncrossed, slowly, and his hands went to his sides. Lord Philip Vane. Yes. My business partner. Yes. The word sat between them like a lit fuse. She could see him processing it, the implications spiraling outward. His partner's wife, in his house, with his partner's child, for 12 days. He'll come here, the Duke said. The quarterly accounts are due in 3 weeks. He comes to Blackthorn for the review every April. I know. Her voice was steady. Her body was not. A tremor ran through her shoulders that she could not suppress. I know exactly when he comes. I know his schedule better than he does, because for 7 years I managed every detail of his household, including the correspondence he was too lazy to read. She stepped away from the wall. 1 step, then another. She was moving toward the door and toward the man blocking it, and she did not stop. I chose this house because it was insane. Because no one fleeing Lord Vane would hide in the home of Lord Vane's partner. Because the most dangerous place is the place no one looks. She was close enough now to see the texture of his coat. Damp wool, a button missing on the left cuff. Close enough to smell horse and leather, and something underneath. Something clean, like soap and cedar. He did not step aside. 3 weeks, he said. I'll be gone before then. With the boy? With the boy. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze, because she was a wrecker, and wreckers do not look away, even when looking costs them. His eyes were grey. She had not noticed that before, in the amber light through the dirty window. Grey and very direct. The eyes of a man who made decisions the way he walked, without hesitation, without detour. Mrs. Blackwood will move you to a proper room, he said, in the main house. The blue guest chamber, 2nd floor. It has a lock on the inside. Rosalind blinked. Of all the things she had prepared for, rage, disgust, a command to leave, the threat of a constable, this had not been among them. Why? Because the East Wing has no working fireplace, and your son will catch his death. That's not why. He stepped aside. The doorway was open now, the corridor behind him lit with pale morning sun through the mended curtain. No, he said. It's not. He walked away. His bootfalls on the stone, flat, certain, purposeful, carried him back through the East Wing corridor, through the connecting door, and into the main house. Rosalind stood in the still room doorway, her broken hand pressed against her ribs, and listened until the sound disappeared. Then she went to find Mrs. Blackwood. The housekeeper was in the kitchen, elbow deep in pastry dough, and when Rosalind appeared in the doorway, not through the servants' passage, but through the main corridor, in full daylight for the first time, the older woman looked at her with an expression that was neither surprise nor relief, but something between the two, like a gardener seeing a plant break through soil she had been watering in secret. He found you then. He found me. I expected it sooner. That curtain was a dead giveaway. Mrs. Blackwood wiped her hands on her apron. The flour left white streaks on the linen. The blue room. I'll have it ready within the hour. The boy can have the room next to it. There's a connecting door. You knew I was there. Since the 3rd day. You left a wet footprint on the still room floor. The housekeeper's hands were steady, her voice matter of fact. I brought the extra bread and the cheese. The cheese. The wedge that Rosalind had thought she had stolen, halved with Thomas on the dusty floor, eaten like mice at a picnic. It had been left for her. Why didn't you tell him? Mrs. Blackwood looked at her, really looked, at the hand that would not bend, at the hollows beneath her eyes, at the way she stood slightly turned, her right side forward, the way a person stands when they have learned that blows come from a particular direction. Because I've seen that hand before, the housekeeper said. On my sister, 30 years ago. She stayed. A pause. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked. You didn't. Rosalind's throat closed. She nodded once, tightly, and went upstairs to collect Thomas and their things, the blanket, the sewing kit, the carved bird, the pages in her stays, and move them into the blue room with the lock on the inside that the Duke had specified, without being asked why a lock was important. The blue room was warm. The fireplace worked. The sheets smelled of lavender, real lavender, recently dried, not the stale ghost of it that haunted the East Wing mattress. Thomas bounced on the bed twice, examined the wallpaper with serious attention, and announced that his bird liked it here. Rosalind sat on the edge of the bed, her back very straight, and looked at the door. The lock was a heavy iron bolt, the kind that could not be picked and could not be forced without noise. She reached over, and slid it home. The sound it made, a deep, solid thunk, vibrated through her fingers and up her arm and settled somewhere behind her breastbone. She exhaled. For the first time in 12 days, the exhale did not require effort. The days rearranged themselves. Thomas ate breakfast in the kitchen with Mrs. Blackwood, who fed him porridge and toast, and did not comment on the speed at which he consumed them. The scullery maid, Ellen, made him a crown out of folded newspaper, and he wore it for 3 days straight, even in bed. The stable boy, James, took him to see the horses, and Rosalind stood at the window of the blue room and watched her son walk across the courtyard, holding a stranger's hand, and felt the strange, terrible vertigo of a woman who has been carrying everything alone and suddenly finds the weight distributed. The Duke kept his distance. This surprised her. She had expected questions. Who, when, how bad, how long? She had prepared answers, clinical, factual, stripped of the emotion that might make a man uncomfortable. But the questions did not come. Instead, the Duke did something more disorienting. He gave her space. She saw him at meals. He had insisted, through Mrs. Blackwood, that she eat in the dining room, not the kitchen, which Rosalind found both generous and slightly absurd, sitting at a table built for 20, with a 5-year-old who ate with his fingers and a Duke who pretended not to notice. She saw him in the corridors, always at a distance that suggested coincidence rather than surveillance. She saw him in the garden, walking with Thomas, the boy chattering and the Duke nodding with the grave attention he might give a solicitor explaining a land dispute. On the 5th day of her visible residence, the 17th since she had climbed through the east wing window, she found the estate ledger. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for a book to read, because the alternative was sitting in the blue room, counting the wallpaper roses and calculating how many days until Lord Vane arrived to review the quarterly accounts. The Duke's study door was open. The desk was covered in papers, and on the corner, held open by an inkwell, was a ledger that she recognized instantly, by type, if not by content. Accounts receivable, expenses, tenant rents, estate maintenance. She read it standing up, turning pages with her good hand, and within 20 minutes she had found 3 errors. Not fraud, not the deliberate, careful falsification she had found in her husband's books, but errors. Honest, clumsy, the kind made by a man who understood agriculture but not arithmetic. "You're reading my accounts." She did not startle. She had heard his bootfalls 3 rooms away, the flat, certain stride she could now distinguish from every other footfall in the house. She closed the ledger and looked at him. "Your steward undercharged the pool tenancy by £8 last quarter. The hay invoice from Merchant & Sons is duplicated on pages 14 and 21. You paid it twice. And your timber revenue is listed under miscellaneous, which means your year-end summary understates your income by roughly £200. The Duke stood in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, the kind of blank that men deploy when they are deciding between offense and curiosity. "You read all of that in 20 minutes. I managed my husband's estate for 7 years. His household accounts, his correspondence, his tenant negotiations. 32 rooms, 11 servants, an annual operating budget of £4,000. She set the ledger down on the desk, precisely where she had found it. He told me I was adequate. He told his friends I was useless. He told me both on the same day, once, and I decided to believe the version that was true." Which version was that? The one that frightened him. The Duke crossed the room and picked up the ledger. He opened it to the page she had marked with a slip of paper, the duplicated hay invoice, and studied it. She watched his jaw work. The muscle at the hinge flexed twice. "Show me the others." She showed him. They stood side by side at his desk for 2 hours, their elbows not quite touching, and Rosalind walked him through every error she had found. The undercharged tenancy, the duplicated invoice, the miscategorized timber. She pointed with her right hand. Her left hung at her side, the fingers curled and useless. He asked questions that were precise and specific, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to understand how she had seen what he had missed. At some point during the second hour, Mrs. Blackwood brought tea. She set 2 cups on the desk without comment, looked at the 2 of them bent over the same page, with their heads close enough that Rosalind could smell the cedar and soap scent of him, and left, with an expression that Rosalind chose not to interpret. "You have a gift," the Duke said when they were finished. "I have a skill. Gifts are given. Skills are built." She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "And you have a problem. Not just the ledger. Your estate is profitable, but it could be more so. Your hay supplier is gouging you. Your timber contracts are below market, and your northern tenants haven't had their rents reviewed in 6 years. Are you offering to fix my estate?" "I'm offering information. What you do with it is your concern." He looked at her over the rim of his teacup. "You're remarkably direct for a woman who hid in my walls for 12 days. "I hid in your walls because I had no choice. I'm standing in your study because I do." She set down the cup. "There's a difference." The difference shaped the days that followed. Rosalind did not ask permission to continue working on the estate accounts. She simply appeared in the study each morning after breakfast, pulled the ledger toward her, and began. The Duke did not ask her to stop. He worked at the opposite end of the desk on his own correspondence, and between them the space was occupied by papers, inkwells, and a silence that grew more comfortable with each passing hour. She discovered the depth of the problem on the 9th day. The estate was not merely mismanaged, it was being bled. Not through fraud, not through malice, but through a contract. A partnership agreement with Lord Vane that was structured so lopsidedly that the Duke was effectively subsidizing Vane's investments while receiving a fraction of the returns. The agreement had been drafted by Vane's solicitor. The Duke had signed it 7 years ago, the same year his wife died, the same year he had retreated from London to Blackthorn and stopped paying attention to anything that was not grief. She stared at the contract for a long time. The handwriting in the margins was familiar. Her husband's scrawl, the cramped, impatient letters she had read on 1,000 household notes. He had annotated the Duke's contract the same way he annotated everything, with the proprietary carelessness of a man who considers other people's documents his own. "You need to see this." The Duke came around the desk. He stood behind her chair, close enough that she felt the warmth of him against her shoulder, close enough that his breath moved the hair at her temple, and read the passage she pointed to. "The revenue split is 60-40, she said. "His favor. For every pound the partnership earns, you receive 40 pence. But the expenses are split 50-50. You're paying half the costs and receiving less than half the income. I know the terms. Do you know they're unconscionable? This would not survive a challenge in Chancery. Any competent solicitor would. I signed it a week after my wife's funeral." His voice was flat, not angry, the particular flatness of a man stating a fact he has lived with for so long it has lost its power to wound. "I would have signed anything that week." Rosalind turned in the chair. She looked up at him, his jaw set, his gray eyes on the contract, the crease between his brows that she now understood was not concentration, but endurance. He had been enduring this contract the way she had endured her marriage, by deciding the cost was less than the cost of fighting. "He took advantage of you," she said. "He was my friend." "He was never your friend. Friends do not write contracts designed to impoverish you. Friends do not—" She stopped. She had been about to say something about what friends do not do to the people they are supposed to protect, and the sentence had brought her too close to her own story, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her. "Friends do not break hands," the Duke finished. quietly, not looking at her. The air between them changed. Something she had been holding at arm's length, the awareness of him as more than a landlord, more than a benefactor, more than a man who happened to own the house she had broken into, moved closer. She felt it in the back of her neck, in her pulse, in the way her broken hand ached as though reminding her what trust had cost her the last time. She stood. The chair scraped against the floor. "I need to check on Thomas." He stepped back immediately. No resistance, no attempt to close the distance. He gave her the space as though it was something she owned. Of course. She found Thomas in the kitchen, building a fortress out of bread rolls with the scullery maid as his loyal subject. The carved bird sat on top of the highest roll, presiding over the domain. Thomas looked up at her with a smile that cracked her chest open every time, because it was uncomplicated. A child's smile, unguarded, unafraid. And she thought, I did this. I took him out of that house and brought him here, and he is building bread castles in a warm kitchen, and he is not afraid. That night, she did not lock the blue room door. She lay in bed, listening to Thomas breathe in the room next door, the connecting door open, per his insistence, and she stared at the iron bolt she had not slid home, and tried to understand what it meant. It did not mean she was not afraid. It meant that the thing she feared had changed shape. She was no longer afraid of what might come through the door. She was afraid of what might happen if nothing did. Lord Vane arrived on a Tuesday. Rosalind knew it was coming. The Duke had told her 3 days earlier, standing in the study doorway with the particular rigidity of a man delivering news he knows will cause pain. The quarterly review. I cannot cancel it without raising suspicion. I know. She had been expecting this. She had counted the days since she arrived, subtracted from the 3 weeks the Duke had estimated, and arrived at the same Tuesday with mathematical certainty. I'll stay in the blue room. Thomas and I will be invisible. You shouldn't have to be invisible in your own... He stopped, caught himself. The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, and they both heard what he had almost said. Your own home. It was not her home. It was his home, and she was a guest, and her husband was coming to sit at his table and discuss accounts that she had spent 3 weeks reorganizing, and she would be upstairs, locked behind an iron bolt, invisible. She hated it. The wrecker in her, the part that had climbed through a window with a child on her shoulder, the part that had criticized a duke's wine storage to his face, the part that had walked out of her husband's house at 4 a.m. with 3 stolen pages and a half-crown. That part wanted to walk down the stairs and sit at the dining table and watch Lord Vane's face when he realized where she had been all along. But Thomas was 5, and Thomas could not be a weapon, and Thomas deserved a mother who made strategic decisions, not dramatic ones. So she stayed. She heard the carriage arrive. She stood at the blue room window, a different window than the one in the servants' passage, cleaner, higher, with a wider view of the gravel drive, and watched a black lacquered carriage with gold trim pull up to the front of Blackthorn Hall. The door opened, and her husband stepped out. He looked the same. That was the worst part. She had expected, irrationally she knew, that the intervening weeks would have changed him, that the cruelty would show on his face, visible, legible, a warning to anyone who looked. But Lord Vane looked exactly as he always did. Tall, well-dressed, handsome in the conventional way that made women at parties say, "How lucky you are," and Rosalind smile and say, "Yes," and count the bruises beneath her sleeve. He shook the Duke's hand. They walked inside together. The front door closed. Rosalind pressed her back against the wall and slid down to the floor. Her knees came up, her arms wrapped around them. She was in the same position she had been in 17 days ago, when she had watched Thomas on the step from the servants' passage. But the shaking was different now. Then, It had been desperation. Now it was rage. Thomas was in the garden with the stable boy, safely away from the house. She had arranged it. She had arranged everything. The timing, the distraction, the locked door. With the same meticulous competence she had used to manage 32 rooms and 11 servants and a husband who hit her. She heard them below. The study was directly beneath the blue room, and the voices carried through the floor. Muffled, indistinct, but the rhythms were distinguishable. Her husband's voice, sharp, clipped, the cadence of a man who believes every room belongs to him. The Duke's voice, lower, measured, pausing between sentences in a way she had learned meant he was choosing his words with precision. The meeting lasted 2 hours. She tracked it by the clock on the mantel, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her broken hand in her lap, the stolen pages pressed against her ribs beneath her stays. And then Thomas came inside. She heard the kitchen door open. She heard Mrs. Blackwood's voice, warm, redirecting, and Thomas's voice, bright and unconcerned, asking for milk. She heard footsteps in the corridor, small footsteps, running, because Thomas did not walk anywhere when running was available. And she heard them enter the main hall at the exact moment the study door opened. She was on her feet before she finished the thought. She was at the blue room door before her hand found the handle. She was halfway down the stairs before she heard Lord Vane's voice say, with a sharpness that cut through the floor and the walls and the careful architecture of her plan, "Thomas?" The boy stood in the hallway. The carved bird was in his hand. His newspaper crown was gone, lost somewhere in the garden, and his hair was wild, and his cheeks were flushed from running, and he looked up at his father with an expression that Rosalind recognized, because she had worn it herself for 7 years. The careful blankness of a person assessing danger. Lord Vane stared at his son. His face underwent a series of rapid calculations, surprise, confusion, and then something darker, something that rearranged his features into a mask she knew better than her own face. "Where is your mother?" Thomas said nothing. He held the bird tighter. The Duke stood behind Vane in the study doorway. His body was very still. His eyes moved from Vane to Thomas, to the staircase where Rosalind stood frozen, one hand on the banister, visible to all of them. Lord Vane followed his gaze. He saw her. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rosalind had ever heard. It contained the sound of every calculation her husband was making, the implications, the exposure, the business partnership, the accounts, the missing pages he must have noticed by now. The wife who had vanished with his son and reappeared in the home of the one man who could ruin him. "Rosalind." His voice was the voice he used in company, warm, reasonable. The voice that made people say, "What a gentleman." "My darling, I've been worried sick." She came down the stairs, each step deliberate, her broken hand at her side, visible, the fingers curled wrong. She did not speak until she reached the bottom and stood on the same level as both men and her son, the 4 of them in the entrance hall, like the corners of a square. "Thomas," she looked at her son, "go to the kitchen. Mrs. Blackwood has your milk." Thomas looked at his father, then at his mother, then at the Duke. He was 5 years old, and he had spent 3 weeks in this house being carried and fed and spoken to without raised voices. And he had the finely calibrated threat detector of every child who has grown up in a house where the air changes before the blow lands. He walked to the Duke, not to his father, not to his mother. He walked to the Duke and stood beside him and looked up at Lord Vane and said, in a voice that was small and clear and carried the devastating precision of a child who has observed everything and understood more than anyone suspected, "You don't hit when you're angry." He was talking to the Duke, but he was talking about his father. Lord Vane's mask cracked. It was subtle, a flicker around the eyes, a tightening of the mouth. But Rosalind saw it, and the Duke saw it, and in the hallway, The silence rewrote itself into something that could not be unsaid. The Duke's hand found Thomas's shoulder, gently. The boy leaned into the touch. "Vane?" The Duke's voice was quiet. Not the careful quiet of their first meeting in the still room, a different kind. The quiet of a man who has stopped calculating and started acting. "The boy stays. He is my son. He is a child who just told me, in front of his mother and in front of God, what kind of man you are." The Duke stepped forward, one step. Thomas stayed behind him, shielded by his body. "The boy stays. His mother stays. You leave." "You forget yourself, Ashworth.
We have a contract." "The contract."
Rosalind moved. She reached into the front of her dress. Decorum be damned. She was a wrecker, and wreckers do not perform delicacy when the house is on fire. And pulled the 3 folded pages from her stays. She held them up. "Column 7. Expenditures for maintenance on the Harkness property, which you sold in 1823. £1,500 a year for 3 years, flowing to a property that does not exist." She stepped closer to her husband, close enough to see the vein in his temple pulse. "You've been embezzling from your own partnership. The Duke has been paying half the costs of your fraud." Lord Vane's face went white, not the white of embarrassment, the white of a man watching the foundation of his life crack beneath his feet. His eyes went to the pages. His hand moved, an involuntary reach, the instinct to seize and destroy, and the Duke's arm blocked it, flat and immovable as an iron bar. "Don't," the Duke said. "Those are my private documents." "Those are evidence." Rosalind's voice was steady. Her broken hand hung at her side. Her good hand held the pages high, out of reach. "Evidence of fraud, submitted to the partnership's account. Any solicitor in London would call it embezzlement. Any magistrate would call it theft. You stole them from my desk. You broke my hand." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I think we both know which of those will interest a judge more." The entrance hall was silent. Thomas pressed against the Duke's leg. Mrs. Blackwood stood in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hands, her face set in the expression of a woman who has waited 30 years for a scene like this. The clock in the study ticked. Lord Vane looked at his wife, at his son, at the Duke, at the pages in Rosalind's hand. She watched him calculate. She knew his calculations. She had watched them for 7 years. The costs, the risks, the probabilities. She watched him arrive at the conclusion she had known he would reach. He could not win. Not here, not now, not with the evidence in her hand and a Duke at her back, and a 5-year-old who had just described his character more accurately than any court testimony ever could. "You will regret this," he said to Rosalind. "I regretted marrying you. Everything since has been an improvement." Lord Vane left. The carriage door slammed. The wheels ground the gravel. The sound faded down the drive and into the distance, and into silence. Thomas tugged the Duke's hand. "Is the angry man gone?" "Yes." The Duke crouched, the same way he had crouched on the front step, slow, deliberate, knees on the floor, at the boy's eye level. "He's gone." "Good." Thomas held up the carved bird. "She was scared, I could tell." The Duke looked at the bird, then at Thomas. Then, slowly, over the boy's head, at Rosalind. His eyes were grey and clear, and they held something she had not seen in them before, or had not allowed herself to see. It was not pity. It was not admiration. It was the look of a man who has been living in a house with someone for 3 weeks, and has just realized that the house was empty before she arrived. Rosalind met his gaze. She did not look away. That evening, after Thomas was asleep with the bird on the pillow beside him, and the connecting door open, and the sound of his breathing filling the blue room like a tide, Rosalind went downstairs. The Duke was in the study. The quarterly accounts were spread across the desk. The accounts Lord Vane had come to review. The review that would never happen now. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. "The partnership is dissolved," he said. "My solicitor will have the papers drawn by Friday."
"You'll lose income."
"I'll lose a parasite." He leaned back in his chair. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, jaw, cheekbone, the crease between his brows that she now understood was not concentration or endurance, but the particular expression of a man who has been alone for a very long time and has only recently begun to remember what the alternative feels like. "The estate is profitable on its own. You showed me that." "I showed you where the money was going. That's not the same as showing you profitability." "Close enough." He opened a drawer. He took out a key, small, iron, old. He set it on the desk between them. "The East Wing." She looked at the key. "I've already moved to the blue room." "This isn't for a bedroom. The East Wing has a study, desk, shelves, good light from the south windows. It was my wife's." A pause. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, 7 years weathered, no longer sharp, but still present. "It's been locked since she died. I think she would have wanted someone to use it." Rosalind crossed the room. She picked up the key. It was warm from the drawer and heavy in her palm, and she understood what it was. Not a room, not a study, not a desk with good light. It was permanence. It was him saying, without saying, that she did not have to leave tomorrow or next week or next month. That the blue room with the iron bolt was hers, and the study in the East Wing was hers, and the space at his table, and the corridor with the mended curtain, and the sorted wine cellar, and the still room she had cleaned. All of it, hers. She closed her fingers around the key. The iron pressed into her good palm. Her broken hand hung at her side. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. I'm getting a free estate manager." Her mouth curved. Not a smile, the precursor to one, the same ghost of expression she had seen on his face in the still room that first morning. "I'm expensive." "I'll manage." They looked at each other across the desk. The lamp flickered. The quarterly accounts rustled in a draught from the window. "Somewhere upstairs," Thomas murmured in his sleep. A word that might have been bird, or might have been bread. And the house settled around them with the particular creak of old timber accepting new weight. She did not say what she felt. He did not ask. There would be time for that, she knew it, in the part of her that had survived 7 years and 12 days and a broken hand and a 3-week remaking of everything she thought her life would be. There would be a morning when she came down to breakfast, and he would already be there, and his hand would find hers across the table, and neither of them would flinch. There would be an evening when Thomas fell asleep early, and the house went quiet, and the space between them would close by inches, by breaths, by the slow, earned gravity of 2 people who had learned to trust the same room. But not tonight. Tonight, she held a key, and he watched her hold it, and that was enough. 6 months later, on a morning in October, when the light through the East Wing's study windows was amber and warm, Thomas sat on the front step of Blackthorn Hall. His coat was buttoned correctly, his shoes fit. The carved bird was on the stone beside him, basking in a shaft of autumn sun. The front door opened. "What are you doing?" The Duke's voice, low, warm, carrying the particular register he used only for this boy, bewildered and tender in equal measure. Thomas looked up at him. "Waiting?" "For whom?" "You." The Duke crouched. Slowly, the way he always crouched. Deliberate, knees on the gravel at the boy's level. He picked up the carved bird. "And what are we waiting for, once I've arrived?" "Mama said we're going to the village." Thomas took the bird back and held it carefully. "She said you're buying me new boots." "Am I?" "She said you'd say that." Thomas smiled. The uncomplicated smile, unguarded, unafraid. And the Duke looked at it the way he looked at everything Rosalind and Thomas had brought into his house. With the quiet, stunned gratitude of a man who opened his door, expecting an empty step, and found, instead, everything. Behind them, in the East Wing study, Rosalind stood at the window. The same window she had watched from on that first morning, but cleaned now, the glass clear, the amber light replaced by true October gold. She looked down at the step where her son had sat alone with a carved bird, and she looked at the man who crouched beside him, and she pressed her good hand flat against the glass, and the glass was worn.